But say you don't have packets of wine yeast lying around, or let's say you want to use more natural methods to ferment your wines or ciders, then there are plenty of options for you to choose from. How can you make wine without yeast? This is a question that I've seen viewers asking, and I'm going to answer this question and more, so let's get to it. So how can you make wine without yeast? The truth is, you can't. Now, before you leave, I'm going to pose what I think is a better question, answer that, and give you some homebrewing ideas. But first, let's address why you can't make wine without yeast. Fermentation is a process in which microorganisms turn things like sugar, carbs, or alcohol into alcohol, acids, or vinegar. And without those microorganisms, that process does not happen. So without yeast, once again, there is no wine. But what I think a great question for a home brewer to ask instead is, how can we make wine without commercial yeast? Yeast is literally everywhere, but commercial yeast is special because it's tried and true. We know that this specific yeast strain will vigorously turn sugars into alcohols on a reliable basis. But say you don't have packets of wine yeast lying around, or let's say you want to use more natural methods to ferment your wines or ciders, then there are plenty of options for you to choose from. Yeast is literally everywhere and not just on the shelf at the store. I'm currently brewing 1 gallon of hard cider, or cider as the rest of the world calls it, and I have no added ingredients. All I've added is fresh pressed apple juice, and this has had no problem fermenting. That's because whenever apple trees grow flowers, bumblebees and other insects go all over the flowers, spreading yeast all over the flowers. The flowers turn into apples. The apples keep that yeast contained within the apple, and then whenever it's pressed out into juice, the yeast is still there. The yeast is then able to turn the sugars in the apple juice into alcohol, creating delicious cider without having to add any commercial yeast. On the other hand, yeast is found on the outer surface of grapes and other soft-bodied fruits. When the grapes are pressed, the yeast is readily available to ferment the juice. If you have a wine recipe using either fresh fruit or fruit juices, as long as that fruit and that juice has not been cooked, has not been pasteurized, and no preservatives have been added, whenever you use that fruit juices, it should ferment all on its own. I was skeptical at first, but whenever I added my fresh pressed apple juice, after only a couple of days, I saw my carboy start bubbling away, and I knew that the yeast was going to work. So using the yeast in the fruit or the juice that you're using is one way to ferment your wine or cider without commercial yeast. Now, let's say you're using pasteurized juice. I actually have a video that I've already made about how to add wild yeast to that pasteurized juice, and I'm going to put the link down in the description below. But long story short, if you don't want to watch the video, all you need to do is put that pasteurized juice in a quart-sized mason jar and then allow it to sit outside at night away from critters and bugs. And as the wind blows over your juice, as cheesy and silly as it sounds, yeast will be added to the juice, inoculating the juice and adding the necessary yeast for fermentation. I highly recommend you put some sort of mesh bag on top of your mason jar full of pasteurized juice to do your best to keep any debris out. And if bugs happen to find your juice before you do, you need to simply start over, try again, and hope for the best. This method seems strange, but it really does work. I have absolutely fermented Mott's apple juice by simply leaving it outside. After 1 day, I brought it back inside, put a proper fermenting lid on top of it, and watched it bubble away. A third method that you can use if you're trying to make wine without commercial yeast is if you make sourdough. Sourdough ferments in the exact same way that wine ferments. The wild yeast strains that you gathered in your dough is turning sugars in your bread into alcohol and producing CO2 as a byproduct, which causes that expansion of the bread. And whenever you bake your bread, it bakes off all of the alcohol, which was minimal in the first place. So if you take some of your sourdough starter and add it to your mash, Add it to your wort if you're making beer. Add it to your fresh pressed apple juice if you so desire. It will inoculate your brew and add the necessary yeast to get it bubbling away. So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. If you're looking to turn grape juice into wine, apple juice into cider, or any other fruit juice that you can imagine into some homebrewed concoction, the yeast is out there. Here is one thing that I want you to know before you try any of these methods. To get started brewing, yeast needs oxygen. So whenever I add my juice to the carboy, if you're making wine, your juice, and your sugar, I do shake it to incorporate oxygen, and I might do that for 1, 2, or 3 days. But once yeast gets started, once it's reproducing and you see your airlock bubbling, oxygen becomes the enemy. Because you're not using pasteurized juices, because you're not using additives to kill the natural yeasts, that means that there's also bacteria present. And bacteria wants to spoil and ruin your wine or your cider. So after those first few days, having your airlock on and keeping oxygen out of your brew is absolutely essential. Too much oxygen can awaken and encourage bad bacteria to do bad things to your wine. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That's how you can brew without commercial yeasts. And no, you cannot make wine without yeast. Thank you so much for watching and happy brewing.